Hi guys, so I wanted to do a video since I'm kind of at the beginning of this outlining process still, and I wanted to do a video that I thought might be helpful that is going to have kind of a couple of different things in it actually, because they all kind of lead into each other, and I was having a hard time figuring out how I was going to separate these into their own videos. So we're just going to kind of lump them all together. Isn't that going to be fun? So with this, I'm a fair amount into the outlining process of this book so far. I have decided that I'm going to kind of try to follow the Save the Cat model while mixing this in with the medicine journey, which is, if you're familiar with the hero's journey and all that jazz, is kind of the precursor of the hero's journey. But in this case, it's kind of got an element of that as well, mixed in with the Save the Cat that I'm going to be trying to conform this story to a little bit, just as one, a little bit of practice for me to actually be able to do that, and two, because the story just really kind of fits really well in with that particular plotting structure. So without further ado, I'm going to start off with some super basic formatting, because what I actually do when I'm doing my first draft is I plug in my outline into a pre-formatted basically format style as if I was going to print the book. And then I draft into that. So I'll show you what I'm talking about here in just a moment, but I basically start with an already formatted book and then I draft into those blank pages. So first things first, what I do is I go ahead and I go to Layout in Microsoft Word. I go to Page Size, or Size rather here. Right now it's at normal old 5.5 by 11. I want to go to more page sizes, and I'm going to change this to 5 by 8. That's the size I tend to prefer because my books are not particularly long. They're usually only about 75,000 words. On the first draft, they're usually more like anywhere between 65 to 75,000. I have yet to have one longer than that. This particular one may end up being longer than that because it is going to be a standalone and it is high fantasy. So there will be quite a bit of world building and description in it, which will add quite a bit to my word count. But for now, I'm going to leave this as 5 by 8. If you have a book that will, depending on your font sizes and style choices and stuff, will be longer than about 600, 700 pages when it's all said and done, you may have to up this to a larger size for KDP to allow you to print it. If you have too long of a book, it doesn't want to print books that are too thick, that are this size. So you might have to up it to like 6 by 9, which is another common size book, or do something like that. But for now, I'm going to leave this as 5 by 8. So meaning 5 inches this way, 8 by this way. So the next thing I'm going to go to is the margins, because as you can see, these margins look really screwy. So right now it's set to this, and that's kind of the default setting. I'm going to go to custom margins. Now, obviously, you can do whatever you want with your margins and play around with it, see what is aesthetically pleasing to you. I like to have 5 or 0.5 on top, 0.5 on bottom, 0.5 to the right, and on the left, which will end up being my gutter, I want it to be 0.7. The other thing you're going to want to do on this page, you want to make sure that you have it set to mirror margins so that it will be correctly formatted for having a larger margin in your middle section of the book, which is your gutter, so that your words don't run into that middle fold and people can't read them, and smaller margins on the outsides. So with that, as you can see, this may look a little bit weird to you if you're not familiar with how formatting the margins go. You can see that this margin here, well, let me fix a little bit of this just real quick. So obviously you don't want these jagged edges on the side here typically. I mean, that's a style choice, but that's not typically how you're going to want it. You're going to want to set this to justified so that it's a nice straight little block of text without any jagged edges. So with this, as you can see with this like this margin on the outside is much bigger than this margin on the outside. That's because when you print this, and I don't know why Microsoft Word has these switched around to make it confusing, but it does. This will actually be in the middle of the book right here, and this margin will actually be on the outside because this page will actually end up being on this side of the book when it's printed. Got it? Got it. Okay. Maybe that makes sense. Let's see. But anyway, from here, since I want to actually put everything in the kind of format that I would want the book in so that I can draft into that format and have most of the formatting already done by the time I'm done with the first draft, I want to make this first page the title page. Now I've already got my title page stuff written out here. So let's go ahead and get this stuff moved on over to a different page that is not my title stuff. We're going to move this stuff to the center just because that's where I want it. You can honestly have yours wherever you want, and depending on your style, you can have it different. Anybody who's familiar with the book The Left Hand of Darkness, which is a sci-fi book from quite a while back, actually. The best part of that book is the frickin' foreword by the author. It's fantastic because she delves into how everybody claims that sci-fi is derivative and that it's escapism, but then when you ask them why they don't read sci-fi, they say because it's too depressing, which is contradictory to it being escapist because you wouldn't want to escape into something that's too depressing. But anyway, she dives into that and dives into how all authors are liars. They're just very good at being liars, and they trick you into believing things that aren't real for a short period of time while you're reading the book, and then when you close the book you regain your sanity. And it's actually hilarious. It's so much fun to read. I absolutely recommend that book. But because this book I'm doing in a kind of a similar writing style to that, I have a mock-up title I probably won't end up keeping, where I'm calling it The Right Hand of Light instead of The Left Hand of Darkness, just kind of as a little joke for myself, and probably nobody else will actually get that on their own. But I thought it was fun. So I'm going to go ahead and put these into the pages that I want them in here before I change the font. So this one I also want to be centered for now. And then we'll move this one. Now, the one thing you want to remember is when you're formatting a book, you want your prologue or foreword or whatever you want on this side of the page so that it is not on the back of a page when you're reading the book. You want it to be on the front as you first open the book. You want this part to be on this side of the book. And then let's see, same thing for the very first chapter of the book. The rest of the chapters, you only have so much control over that, so don't worry about it too much. I've noticed that other books don't worry about that too much, professionally published ones. You only have so much control over that unless you're going to cut or add content to a chapter just to make it so that it's on the other side. But of course, that would butterfly effect into all your other chapter starts. So that would be very difficult to control. So we're going to go ahead and do that for a couple of chapters here just so that you kind of get the idea and you can see what I'm talking about here. So this one we want centered as well. And we'll go ahead and go through chapter 3 because why not? And if you're reading any of this outline, I apologize in advance. There's probably horrible grammar and spelling and all that jazz. So there we go. We got a couple of chapters where they're all kind of separated, and we're going to start on the title page. Now, here's one of the funnest parts to me about formatting is picking the font. Now, in this particular one, because my story is going to have the aesthetic of ancient China, basically the environment, the architecture, the clothing, my characters will appear Asian in origin, specifically from certain regions of China, because I mean, there's different bone structures and facial shapes and skin tones and so on and so forth for different regions in China, if you're not familiar with that. And I'm going to be kind of theming their culture off of the ancient fictional dynasty of the Shah dynasty, spelled X. Oh gosh, how is it spelled? XIA, I believe it is. But that was a fictional dynasty, by the way. And I'm going to be kind of kind of theming everything after that style of the paintings and stuff that were allegedly from that time. So because I think it's like a really pretty aesthetic. Basically, I think it's a beautiful aesthetic, and because part of the themes of this is going to be largely themed off of yin and yang type style of stuff, not specifically yin and yang, but just kind of the whole idea of the balance of things, the balance of good and evil, and how they both have their pluses and minuses and such is a major theme of this. I thought that that aesthetic fits in with that theme very, very well. So I chose this style font, honestly, because I couldn't find a better font. But if, let's say, you're writing fantasy and your fantasy book is set in a very Arthurian legend style time of let's say, what am I thinking of? Like the Middle Ages or something, you could use a font maybe like this one here, assuming I can get it to work. Like this one. Let's make this bigger so that you can actually see what I'm talking about. Let's put that as 26. So doesn't that immediately bring to mind like King Arthur, Middle Ages, princesses, dragons, and towers, so on and so forth. So you could use a font like that if you're doing something that's fantasy. You could also do one that's a little bit more like this, which would also be reminiscent of that if you see it. However, to me, for some reason, I think more of Beowulf than King Arthur when I see this particular font. A similar style of things. You could also, if let's say you're doing something that's kind of like, for some reason, when I see this font, I immediately think of Back to the Future. That's what I think of. Find a font that makes you think of something that's similar to the setting or the themes of your book. Another really fun one that always makes me think of Aladdin. Every time I see this font, I always think of Aladdin. Where is that font? Where is it? This one. This one always makes me think of Aladdin. It's kind of a similar style to that, and it's got a very kind of Middle Eastern Arabic style to it. And this is just one of the default fonts. If you want a font similar to that, you can obviously find better fonts, but this is just one of the default ones. This one to me screams sci-fi, and that's why I've used it in past books that I have that are sci-fi. There's all sorts of ones that you can pick from in here. Romance novels quite frequently go with a very flowy, very cursive style, romantic looking font. Let me try to find one as an example. Something like that would maybe be like a romance book, might start with that. Like I'd imagine Wuthering Heights having this particular style, even though I don't see how that book is romance. I hate that book. God, I hate that story. But I hated oh God, what's the one with Rhett and Scarlett? Scarlett O'Hara. God, I hate her. She's a manipulative woman. But sorry, somebody out there hates me right now because they like love that book and they think that that's an actual romance. Oh God. But that's like an example of a font that you might use for that. There's one in particular here I wanted to show as an example of Western. Oh, it's called Playbill. Sorry, I just got like some of these fonts memorized at this point. Because I find this aspect of this very fun. Like for example, doesn't that make you think of like an old Western or something? So just pick a font that you think best suits your story's aesthetic, and then go with that. They didn't have one that I thought was best for a Shah era China in here, because honestly, to me, this looks a little bit more, I don't know. It looks more Japanese in origin to me, because there are differences. Some people will say, "Oh, there's not a difference in the aesthetics." It's like, yes, there is. Don't ever say that to anybody who's from any of those places. They tend to not be terribly fond of each other. So I'm probably being super offensive saying that, and I apologize if I am. But this is like an example of how I would do a title page. This is a font that I would maybe pick for this style. Not really, because I would want something that looks more obviously like it would be ancient Chinese style font. But we're going to stick to that for now. because it's the best I've got for the moment. And then we're gonna put this on each one. I would want this to be, I typically do my title pages for my chapters in bold, and then I will usually have the top line, because I like to do chapter titles, and I'll usually underline the part that says like chapter 1 and then have the chapter title not underlined. And then I usually like this to be a size 12 font, which it is already, and this I typically like to be a size 26, depending on what font I'm going with. So let's see, next one, we're going to go ahead and just do this to a couple of chapters so that you can see what it looks like. Bold, underline, 26. And if you look at professionally published books, you will notice, sorry, I'm sitting here contemplating on whether or not I should just start this video over, and whether or not some of the things I set up here could be construed as insulting. I certainly don't mean them to be. I'm not trying to be like culturally insensitive or anything like that. If I am, feel free to complain in the comments, and I will give you a personal apology. It is certainly not my intent to do that. But anyway, that's that. We're going to move on. We're going to move on. So there we go. We got this chapter 1. And as you can see, I've got my outline in here where I basically got a summary of what's going to happen in chapter 1. And then here, theoretically, is where I would start writing the actual beginning of the chapter. And then I could scroll back up and go through here. And with this, as I write down the events, what I usually do is I go back and I would highlight what I've already written. Typically, I tend to do that in this font first, or this highlight color, just so that I can kind of track. It's like, okay, well, I've already written this portion. I know this is where I need to take off if I start or I stop writing partway through a scene, and then I can kind of keep track of where I was at in the outline a little bit more easily. That way, hopefully that makes sense. But here's an example of like first lines. These are not good first lines, but whatever. So like I'm starting from this part here where the princess is walking through the garden with her mother. She's carrying a book with her. And I don't stick like very, very strictly through this because as you can see in my example of a first sentence, I have the garden was radiant in the mid-morning sun. However, Princess Wen didn't take note of its splendor. She was far too engrossed in the contents of the book she was reading. So, as you can see, that starts more where she's like sitting there reading a book rather than she's actually walking with her mother already. I don't stay super engrossed in this. And as you can see, I've got like little parts where it's just like, I don't know what era I'm going to give this a name for. I don't have any names for the characters as of yet. The next video I do, I'm going to talk about how I start figuring out what the names of my characters are going to be at this point so that I can plug those into my outline, as well as some character building and some description of those characters I'm going to do in the next part of this. But that's basically how I start formatting this. I would do the same thing with the next bit so that I can draft my first draft with it already being essentially formatted for the most part, other than the page numbers and that jazz, because that I come back to later. I usually do that towards the end. I don't usually do that at the beginning part here. And then, as you can see this is all jagged. I would want to make this justified. And then another basic thing for formatting, depending on how you want to do this, most books that I see do not have the first paragraph indented in the chapter. And then what they will do is they will either have no indents throughout their paragraphs, or they will have a small indent by going to paragraph, just like you saw me do with a left click, and then going to first line. And then you could do 0.5, which is the default, but I usually do 0.3 because I think 0.5 is a little bit too much. And they would have it like this, where the first paragraph is not indented, but the rest are. I hate how that looks personally, and I like to indent all of them by going to paragraph, first line, indent by 0.3. And then I just like how that looks better. I don't like how it looks without the indent on the first thing. I like everything to be uniform, and it just bugs me to not have that also indented. I also usually like my line spacing to be at least, and then I usually like this after to be at 6 and this at 0. And as you can see, that's how that affects that. So it squishes it a little bit more, but without it being super squished like single spacing. Uh, so that's some basic formatting and how I kind of get my books set up for me to draft in a mostly already formatted book. Hopefully this was helpful. If you think this is interesting to do it this way, hopefully you enjoyed this as an idea. One reason why I've started doing this is because I found that when I didn't start it in this, I didn't have a good idea of approximately how many pages into the book I already was, and at which points I maybe need to start hitting different beats in the story, or when I need to get out of the first act and into the next one, kind of getting a good idea of approximately how many pages I'm actually at in how it would look if it was printed. I found that this helps me with figuring out when I need to move on to different beats in the plot beats, and when I need to move into a different act of the story, and when I need to start wrapping up a certain part. Otherwise, I might end up uh, taking too long to do certain things, or not taking enough time is more common for me because I'm an underwriter. Another thing that I found that really helps with this is that it makes it really, really obvious when I have too dialogue heavy of a scene or too narrative heavy of a scene, because if you're too dialogue heavy, you'll start noticing an awful lot of white page parts and an awful lot of blank sections where it just starts looking more like it's a script. And if it's too narrative heavy, I'll start noticing that I've got too many things like this, where it's just blocks of text and there's no dialogue or anything going on there, or internal monologue if perhaps you're writing in either first person or third person deep. I tend to write in third person deep, so that makes that stick out for me. Um, um, with this, uh, something that I want to mention in regards to that, and this is something that Brandon Sanderson talks about in one of his lectures that he has, where he references a friend of his or somebody that he knew, an acquaintance, who plays Magic: The Gathering, the cards, and how his friend observed that when he first started playing the game, he would have to focus on every little thing that he did, and it would take quite a bit of concentration. But as he got better at the game and he got more practice, he realized that he didn't have to focus on so many of the things that he used to have to focus on. He would just kind of instinctually know to do them. And I think that Brandon Sanderson was very right when he observed that writing is that way too, where you'll get to the point where instinctually, as you write and you get more practice, you'll not have to focus on certain elements of the storytelling, and you can give more focus to higher level problems as you're writing, I believe is how he phrased it. And with this, when I write in this format and I draft in this format, I find that it helps me to not have to focus so much on, oh, well, should I be coming up on the end of a chapter? How many pages do I really have? I can just kind of see, oh, I'm about 10 pages in. To me, my chapters usually tend to be about 10, 15 pages. And if it goes longer than that, I notice that for me, it means I've started dragging and I've hit a lull in the scene where I'm just writing to be writing and I'm not actually getting anything done in the chapter. So this helps me realize when I'm doing that without having to actually actively focus on it. It also, like I mentioned, helps me notice subconsciously when I've got a big wall of narrative text or a whole page of dialogue without any narrative, and I've got white page syndrome going on. Without me actually having to focus intently on that issue, I can just subconsciously take in, hey, this page doesn't look right, I need to do something about this, and then fix it. So hopefully this has been helpful to you. Sorry I've been a bit rambly in this video. We basically kind of covered how you can do your page sizes, how you can do your margins, how you can pick a font style that works for you, and how you can theoretically use this from the very, very beginning in your drafting to draft your first draft in an already formatted book and have your outline right there for you in each chapter if you outline on a chapter level. So hopefully this has been helpful. I hope it hasn't been too terribly rambly, and you guys have a great day. Next video that I will be doing will probably be talking about how I figure out my character descriptions and my character names, so that I can kind of know in the outlining phase what these characters look like and all that jazz. So you guys have a great day, and I will talk to you later. Bye-bye.